Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessel Noor in Baltimore. The world's 8th largest bank has taken one of the most aggressive steps to date to fight climate change. BNP Paribas says it will stop financing tar sands projects, considered the dirtiest way to extract fossil fuels. This follows last week's news that oil and gas pipeline giant TransCanada canceled a massive expansion of the Energy East pipeline that would carry Alberta tar sands across Canada. Meanwhile, advocates are calling for other big banks to follow suit, including JP Chase, the top U.S. funder of tar sands oil. Now joining us to discuss all of this is Keith Stewart. He's the head of Greenpeace Canada's Climate and Energy Campaign. Welcome back to The Real News, Keith, and thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
So talk about what you make of this latest news. What's behind the decision?
So this is big just because BNP Paribas is such a large bank, 8th largest bank in the world. Previously, we've seen another major European bank, ING, come out saying, they would not fund tar sands pipelines. We have here in Canada, our largest credit union, Desjardins, is looking at making the same step, although they haven't made a final decision yet. But BNP Paribas went even further. They said, not only we're not going to fund those pipelines, which is one of the things, Greenpeace has been really focused on, because they're the things that enable the expansion of the tar sands. They've also said, they're going to get out of funding companies that get more than 30% of their revenue from tar sands, from shale oil and gas, and they're also not going to finance any Arctic oil exploration. So those are big steps, and this is a sign that I think the finance sector is recognizing that getting behind renewable energy, getting out of fossil fuels is not just the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. Banks don't take these kind of steps thinking if they think they're going to lose a lot of money. I think BNP Paribas is looking, as we say here in Canada, they're looking to where the puck is going, not where it is right now. And they're saying, that's where the future is. And that's something we've been saying to all the other banks. Greenpeace, we've written to, I think, about 27, 28 banks about this. We're in conversation with a number of them. And we're being listened to in a way that we wouldn't have been 5 years ago, where we would have been laughed off. We're seeing projects being canceled. We're seeing skyrocketing investment in renewables. That's good news for the climate, and it's good news for the air that we breathe, for the water that we drink.
Now, what kind of impact is this going to have on current and future tar sands projects? Because we know, for example, with the Dakota Access Pipeline project, there was a whole web of banks and other financial institutions like Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, that were all lending that project money. So is this going to have a tangible impact anytime soon?
I think so. I think the Dakota Access conflict there was a real wake-up call for a lot of these banks, and there was sort of a big push on the people who were financing it. And they were like, oh, because pipelines used to be basically boring and safe. They didn't make a lot of money, but it was steady. There was no real controversy. Now that's no longer true, and I think we're seeing, it's about protecting water, about protecting livelihoods, and also about fighting climate change. So I think a lot of the banks are taking a second look at these types of projects, recognizing that there's risk there that they didn't see before, and that socially, environmentally, these are bad bets, and increasingly financially, they're a risky bet. So we've identified the 25 top funders of tar sands pipelines in North America. We're talking to all of them. A lot of them, some of them pulled out, actually. They pulled their money out of Dakota Access after they saw what was happening there. Some of them, we're working on really hard to get to pull out of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, the Keystone XL, the Enbridge Line 3, which sort of goes through Manitoba and Saskatchewan here in Canada. And we just saw, as you mentioned, the cancellation of Energy East, which would have been the largest of all of these pipelines, over 1 million barrels per day. And the company has just decided, they're taking it off the books. They know that there isn't going to be oil to fill that pipeline. There's no longer the demand for that oil. There's no market for it. And that's the direction the economy is going. And that's a good sign. The only problem right now is it's not happening fast enough.
And talk a little bit about tar sands themselves. I have mentioned how it's the dirtiest way to extract energy. What kind of impact does this have on the environment, the community surrounding it, and many native populations that live in those regions?
So the difference between tar sands, some people call them oil sands, and conventional oil is conventional oil. You drill down into the ground, and there's liquid down there, and you pump it up. In tar sands, it's actually, you have to melt it out of the ground. It's a solid. It's sort of mixed up with sand and with clay, and so it takes an enormous, imagine, how much energy it takes to melt. It's got the consistency of peanut butter. So imagine having to melt peanut butter to get it to flow and to pull it out, and then you have to do extra processing. That means using a whole bunch of water, because you use water basically and steam to melt the stuff. That water is contaminated. There's now, the second largest dam in the entire world after the Three Gorges Dam in China is in northern Alberta. It's made out of dirt, and it's holding back, a massive lake of toxic waste. Some of that leaks. We're seeing impacts downstream on the water. You also have a lot of air pollution, and you have particularly, Canada, we call them First Nations communities, Indigenous communities, downstream, downwind, who are worried about the health impacts, and they're seeing increased incidence of certain types of rare cancer associated with petroleum products. But also, along the pipeline routes, people are really worried about spills. Because, again, this isn't regular oil. If you're pumping it's called bitumen, so diluted bitumen, they actually have to add really light oils to it to get it liquid enough to flow. If that leaks, it doesn't behave like normal oil. As we saw in the massive spill that happened in Michigan in 2010, what happens is the light parts evaporate off very quickly, which is bad for the breathing of anyone around. But the other parts, they'll sink to the bottom, and then they mix it in the soil. It's really hard to get out. You can't just skim it off the top. It actually sinks down into the water, stays there, contaminating the rivers. And so, in BC, where the Kinder Morgan pipeline is, salmon is a major part of the economy. If one of these pipelines spills into a salmon stream, you're not going to be able to clean it up, and that's where the salmon spawn. If they're laying eggs in contaminated soil, that's not good for salmon. That's not good for livelihoods. You've got 14,000 jobs in British Columbia on our west coast, which depend on basically clean water, healthy ecosystem, fisheries, forestry, ecotourism. And if you're talking about creating 50 jobs for a pipeline that goes through, that's not a great risk-benefit calculus there. So they're saying, well, let's actually invest in renewable energy, let's invest in energy efficiency rather than expansion of these very dirty fossil fuels, because the more we used up all the easiest to get out oil first. Increasingly now it's coming from the tar sands, it's coming from fracking, which is also has a whole bunch of problems around water contamination. We need to get away from these extreme fossil fuels, going to the Arctic to drill, and move towards that renewable energy economy. And that's why, one of the reasons tar sands has taken a big hit, since the price of oil dropped in 2014, we've seen 2 million barrels per day worth of projects get canceled or put on hold. That's how much oil Canada uses in a day. That's a massive amount of oil. And that's because this is high carbon. It's also really high cost. It costs a lot of energy to get this stuff out of the ground and then to the extra processing required. So, this is the stuff that really needs to stay in the ground to fight climate change. And it's also one of the biggest threats to water quality, which is, everyone cares. That if your water's contaminated, you're in big trouble.
All right, Keith Stewart, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully this is just the beginning of much more good news on this front, because as we know, there's wildfires in Canada. Puerto Rico's still recovering from, and Houston and Latin America, Central America and Florida are still recovering from hurricanes, so this is more urgent than ever that action takes place. So we hope to have you on again soon with some more good news. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.